Why did no one stop him that night? That question would echo across Fort Harland base for years, whispered through corridors, remembered in silence by those who'd seen too much and too afraid to act. But before the silence was broken, there was only one sound that mattered, the low hum of machines in the desert night. It was 2:47 a.m. The Nevada desert stretched endless and dark, a sea of cold sand under a cloudless sky. The wind whispered across the fences, carrying the faint metallic rattle of chain link and the soft rhythm of rotating radar towers. Inside the heart of the base, the operations wing, the air was still. Monitors glowed in faint blues and greens, each pulse of light painting faces that had long forgotten what sleep felt like. Lieutenant Sarah Collins sat alone at her terminal, eyes focused, posture perfect. The faint buzz of electricity filled the room, a constant companion through her 12-hour night shifts. She wasn't just any officer. She was the one who always followed procedure, the quiet one who didn't raise her voice, who didn't drink, who didn't complain. Her colleagues respected her. Her superiors tolerated her. And one man, her commanding officer, Major Briggs, despised her discipline like a mirror showing him what he no longer was. Sarah's hands moved with mechanical precision across the console, finalizing the surveillance report from Sector 7. The drone feed from the outer perimeter had shown nothing unusual, just heat ripples from the sand and the faint ghost of distant dunes. She signed off with her ID code, timestamped the file, and exhaled. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to lean back. The glow from the screen reflected off her tired eyes. Her reflection in the glass looked different these days, older, worn, and somehow lonelier. She thought of her father again. Sergeant Daniel Collins, KIA, Afghanistan, 2010. He had once told her, "Courage doesn't shout, Sarah. It stands still when the world shakes." She still lived by those words. But that night, courage would have to do more than stand still. It would have to bleed. The door slammed open behind her. Boots stomped across the metal floor, uneven, heavy, drunk. "Lieutenant Collins." Major Briggs' voice cut through the hum of the room, rough, slurred, and soaked in anger, the kind of tone soldiers learn to fear long before they understand why. Sarah stiffened immediately, rising to her feet, posture flawless. "Sir," she said, calm and clear. Briggs was a large man, broad shoulders, square jaw, medals that caught the light. Once a decorated combat officer, now more shadow than soldier. His uniform was unbuttoned at the top, the smell of whiskey drifting like a confession. "Where?" "The drone report from Sector 7, he barked. "Don't play games with me." "It's on your desk, sir, time-stamped and filed an hour ago." He squinted at her, swaying slightly. "You're lying. You think I don't know when someone's hiding something." Sarah kept her tone steady, voice professional, almost soft. "Sir, the report was processed as required. You can verify the log." But logic was wasted on rage. Briggs stepped closer. His breath was sour with liquor, his eyes bright with something darker. "You think you can correct me, you little." He laughed, a low, cold sound. "Don't forget who runs this base." Sarah didn't flinch, but her heart pounded. Every soldier in the ops room froze, pretending to be invisible, the kind of silence that screams louder than any protest. They'd seen this before, too many times. Nobody ever stopped him. Sarah glanced briefly toward the security camera above the door, a single red light blinking. Recording, witnessing. A silent ally. "Sir," she said quietly, "you're out of line." That sentence, simple, factual, was the spark. Briggs' hand moved faster than thought. A heavy fist slammed into the side of her head. The world spun. Her headset flew across the room, crashing to the floor. A sharp pain shot through her skull as she hit the wall and slid down, breath gone, eyes wide in disbelief. For 1 second, the world was only the hum of machines. No one moved. No one breathed. Blood trickled down her temple, a thin red line against her pale skin. Her fingers trembled as she steadied herself against the console. She didn't cry, didn't scream, only straightened her back, slow, deliberate. "Major," she said through the pain, voice shaking but clear, "you've just assaulted a fellow officer." Briggs stared at her, chest heaving. Then he smirked, that cruel, arrogant smirk of a man too powerful to fear consequences. "You think anyone will believe you?" he sneered. "You're a nobody. I own this base." He turned and walked out, laughing under his breath. His boots echoed down the corridor like a sentence being written. Sarah stood alone, the room frozen around her. Her colleagues stared at the floor, guilt heavy in their eyes. No one spoke. Not even her friend, Sergeant Mark Reeves, who sat 2 terminals away, fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. When the door closed, Mark finally moved. "Sarah," he whispered, rushing to her side, "you need now." "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her. "Just dizzy." "You're not fine, he hit you." She looked at him then, and in her eyes wasn't fear. It was something colder, determination. "I need you to pull the security feed from this room, now, before he wipes it." Mark hesitated. "You really want to go that route? You know what that means?" Sarah nodded, blood still running down her cheek. "It means no one else gets hit, not after me." Minutes later, Mark was in the security office, heart pounding as he accessed the classified internal system. The footage played back in silence, the moment frozen in time. Briggs' hand, her fall, the soldiers' stunned faces. It was all there, undeniable. He hovered over the file, export, restricted military channel only. He hesitated, his pulse raced. This wasn't protocol, this was career suicide if it went wrong. But he clicked upload. The label read, "Urgent Internal Report, Assault at Fort Harland, classified." The file transmitted through encrypted channels, a digital whisper traveling straight toward the Pentagon. By 3:12 a.m., somewhere in Washington, D.C., a red alert icon blinked on a secure console. The system flagged it, Priority Alpha Internal Breach Report. And the clock began to tick. Back at Fort Harland, Sarah sat quietly in the infirmary. The medic taped her head, expression awkward, like someone treating a wound they weren't supposed to acknowledge. "Just a cut," he muttered. "You'll be fine." "Fine," she echoed softly. When she looked up, her reflection in the small mirror caught her off guard. The bandage, the tired eyes, the faint trembling in her jaw. She had spent her whole career believing in the system, believing that honor was stronger than fear. But fear had been running the base for years. And now fear had picked the wrong target. She left without a word. Outside, the horizon was beginning to shift, faint streaks of orange cutting through the desert dark. The dawn light caught on the antenna towers, the fences, the vehicles parked in neat rows. It all looked orderly, controlled. But under that surface, something had already broken. Inside his office, Major Briggs poured another drink, hands shaking. He told himself it would disappear, that she'd back down, that everyone always did. But deep down, even he felt it, a quiet dread. Because this time someone had seen, someone had recorded. And somewhere far away, someone was already watching. At 4:03 a.m., the base alarm sounded, not loud but official. Base lockdown initiated, command override. Soldiers emerged from quarters, confused, whispering. Helicopter rotors began to hum in the distance. The officers on duty exchanged glances, none of them briefed, none of them knowing why. And Sarah, she just stood outside the barracks, wind tugging at her uniform, watching the first light crawl across the desert floor. She knew it wasn't over, not even close. What she didn't know, what no one could guess, was that in just a few hours, 3 black SUVs would roll through those gates, and 3 generals would walk into Fort Harland to decide the fate of everyone inside. But for now, the desert stayed silent. Only her heartbeat, steady, relentless, reminded her that something had begun. Something far bigger than her. And somewhere inside, beneath the fear and the throbbing pain, Sarah whispered to herself what her father once said. Courage doesn't shout, it endures. How long could silence protect a man like that? That question lingered in the air long after the sun rose over the Nevada desert. By morning, Fort Harland looked ordinary again. Crisp uniforms, marching feet, the smell of coffee drifting from the mess hall. But beneath that routine, every step, every glance carried unease. Something invisible had shifted. No one spoke about the night before, not officially, not even in whispers. But the silence felt heavier now, like the air before a storm. Lieutenant Sarah Collins sat alone on a bench near the flight hangar, her bandaged head tilted toward the sky. The morning light was too bright, the sound of helicopters warming up too loud. She pressed her palms together, grounding herself. Her thoughts wandered back to her father again, to a moment long buried in memory. She was 12, standing on the porch as the black car pulled up. 2 officers stepped out, hats in hand, eyes downcast. Her mother broke before they even spoke. And Sarah, she didn't cry that day. She couldn't. She had stood still, jaw trembling, staring at the folded flag they handed her. That was the first time she'd learned that silence could hurt more than sound. Now, years later, that same silence had returned, surrounding her, suffocating her, demanding she stay quiet again. But not this time. The metallic hum of a nearby transport plane snapped her back to the present. Across the tarmac, soldiers moved in practiced rhythm, unaware that their base was already under investigation. Somewhere above them, encrypted messages were flying between command centers, red-tagged, classified, urgent. In Washington, the footage had reached the Pentagon's Internal Affairs Network. Protocol dictated that any assault on an officer inside a secure base required an immediate response. Within an hour, 3 names appeared on the mobilization order. General Robert, General Jonathan Harding. Veterans, men of integrity, the kind who didn't flinch at truth even when it burned. At Fort Harland, the calm continued, but cracks were beginning to show. In the operations building, Sergeant Mark Reeves sat in front of his terminal, nerves raw. Every few minutes, he'd glance toward the door, half expecting Briggs to burst in. He knew the risk he'd taken. Uploading that footage without clearance wasn't just a breach. It was an act of defiance that could end his career. But when he thought of Sarah's blood hitting the wall, he didn't regret it. Not for a second. A message alert flashed across his screen. Classified transmission received. Priority access locked. Mark's heart jumped. He clicked it open. The message was short, cold, and terrifying in its precision. Maintain operational lockdown. External command en route. No outgoing transmissions permitted. You are not to engage. Pentagon Internal Oversight Command. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the words. They knew they were coming. And no one, not even Briggs, could stop it now. By mid-morning, the base command office had become a pressure cooker. Major Briggs sat behind his desk, trying to piece together control. His hand trembled slightly as he poured coffee, anything to cover the smell of alcohol still lingering from the night before. He'd heard whispers that a transmission had been flagged at 300 hours. He had tried calling Command Central, no response. His badge access to the classified channel was temporarily suspended. Someone was overriding him. For a man used to control, that realization hit like a bullet. He stormed into the hallway, barking orders. Get me Colonel Davis. Now, I want a full system diagnostic on all comms. I don't care what it takes. A corporal froze mid-sentence. Sir, communications are restricted. Pentagon override. Briggs stopped cold, his face flushed with anger. Who authorized that? Unknown, sir. The order came directly from D.C. He stared at the soldier for a long second, then turned sharply and walked back to his office, faster, harder. His boots echoed through the corridor. For the first time in years, Briggs felt fear creeping in. Out on the base perimeter, Sarah watched as dust began to rise on the far horizon, a faint line of movement against the glare. The sound came next, low, rhythmic, mechanical. Helicopters. The MPs standing at the checkpoint looked uneasy, adjusting their rifles, eyes squinting through binoculars. Who's scheduled for arrival? One asked. No one, the other replied. 3 dark silhouettes appeared, slicing across the desert sky. Behind them, 3 black SUVs followed on the ground, engines rumbling, escorted by armored jeeps. It wasn't a visit. It was an intervention. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She didn't know what would happen next or if she'd even be called in. But deep down, something in her steadied, that quiet place inside her that always found stillness before impact. This was bigger than her now. Inside the base, the intercom cracked to life. Attention all personnel. Base lockdown remains in effect. All non-essential movement is restricted. Report to designated areas immediately. Soldiers exchanged nervous looks. The atmosphere turned electric, the kind of tension that makes every sound sharper, every step heavier. By the time the convoy reached the gates, the entire base had gone silent. You could feel the weight of it, hundreds of eyes watching through windows, doorways, and mirrored glass. The gates opened. 3 generals stepped out. General, tall and composed, with the kind of presence that quiets a room without saying a word. General, older, sharp-eyed, a man who had seen corruption destroy too many good soldiers. And General Harding, calm, deliberate, the one known for finding truth even when it hid behind medals. They walked together, boots striking the ground in perfect unison. Their arrival wasn't just authority, it was judgment given form. Briggs met them at the entrance, trying to mask his panic with professionalism. His salute was crisp, voice forced steady. Generals, welcome to Fort Harland. I wasn't informed of your visit. Didn't return the salute. His voice was even. You weren't supposed to be. That line hit like ice. Harding stepped forward. We'll require full access to your command systems, security feeds, and personnel logs, effective immediately. Briggs forced a laugh, small, nervous. Surely, General, this can wait for a scheduled audit. Cut him off sharply. No, it can't. For the first time, Briggs hesitated, and in that hesitation, everyone in the room saw it. Guilt. He turned toward the operations room, jaw clenched, eyes darting to his officers. Resume duties, he barked. This is just an inspection. But nobody moved. The soldiers watched silently as the generals followed him inside. Sarah was in the medical bay when she heard it, the steady sound of boots approaching, the low murmur of commanding voices. She stood instinctively, heart racing. The medic looked at her. You okay, Lieutenant? She nodded once. I think they're here for him. He didn't ask who him was. He already knew. As she stepped into the hallway, the entire base felt frozen in time. Every officer stood at attention as the generals passed, a wave of authority sweeping through the air. And then through the open door of the command center, she saw him, Briggs, standing rigid, sweat collecting on his temples. General Harding looked at him. Major Briggs, you're aware of the nature of our visit. No, sir, Briggs said tightly. I was hoping you enlighten me. Harding nodded toward Sergeant Reeves, who stood behind the console, pale but resolute. Sergeant, play the footage. The room dimmed as the monitor came alive, the timestamp flashing, 2:47 a.m. And then the sound. A slap. A fall. Silence. Blood on the wall. A woman standing back up. No one spoke. The video played through twice, once for clarity, once for disbelief. Briggs' mouth opened, but no words came out. His face drained of color. This is manipulated footage," he stammered. "It's fake." I stepped closer, voice low and sharp. "You're finished, Major." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the equipment, like the heartbeat of the building itself. Then the door opened. Sarah stepped in. The entire room shifted. Soldiers turned, eyes following her as she walked in slowly, head bandaged, uniform pressed, chin high. Every movement deliberate, every step a statement. She stopped before the generals, saluted with quiet dignity. "Lieutenant Sarah Collins, reporting as ordered." General Harding looked at her, his gaze steady, respectful. "You've done enough, Lieutenant." Briggs, now desperate, lunged forward, shouting, "You think you can take me down? I own this base." Two MPs moved instantly, tackling him to the ground. His shouts echoed down the corridor as he was dragged away, wild, incoherent, meaningless. When the door closed behind him, the silence returned, not fear this time, but release. Sarah stood still, hands trembling slightly. She didn't smile, she didn't cry, she just breathed. General stepped forward, voice softer now. "Lieutenant, what you did tonight will echo far beyond this base." Sarah's eyes lowered briefly. "Sir, I didn't do it for echo. I did it because silence kills faster than bullets." The generals exchanged glances, a quiet acknowledgement of something they'd all known but rarely seen spoken aloud. Outside, the sun had risen high, blazing over the desert. Helicopters waited by the hangars, rotors turning slow and steady. Soldiers moved in silence, unsure what the day meant for them, but somehow lighter. Fort Harland wasn't just a base anymore. It was a mirror reflecting everything that had been hidden. Sarah walked out into the light, the dry wind tugging at her uniform. For the first time in years, she felt something new beneath her ribs, not fear, not anger. Just calm. The kind of calm that follows a storm. How do you rebuild faith in a system that failed you? That question haunted Sarah long after the shouting stopped, and the hallways fell silent again. The sun outside had burned high over the Nevada desert, bleaching the base in a light so harsh it almost looked sterile, as if the world itself was trying to erase what had happened here. But some stains don't wash out. The operations building still hummed quietly. Officers moved through it with the mechanical calm of soldiers pretending nothing had happened. Yet the echo of that single moment, the strike, the gasp, the courage that followed lingered in every sound, every breath. Major Briggs was gone, hauled away by MPs, escorted to a waiting convoy that disappeared beyond the perimeter fence. His shouts had faded into the hot wind, leaving behind only disbelief and a silence that felt different. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the sound of a base realizing truth had finally arrived. That afternoon, Sarah sat in the debriefing room. A single ceiling fan spun lazily above her, clicking every few seconds, a sound that seemed to match the pulse behind her bandage. Across from her sat General Harding, the of the three. His eyes were tired but kind, the kind of gaze that had seen too much war and too many cover-ups. A recorder blinked red between them. "Lieutenant," Harding began quietly, "we're conducting a full internal inquiry. I need your account of last night. I know you've already given a report, but I'd like to hear it in your own words." Sarah nodded, voice low but steady. "Sir, I followed procedure." Major Briggs entered the operations room intoxicated. He demanded the surveillance report I'd already filed. When I clarified, he accused me of lying. I stood my ground. He struck me. I did not retaliate. Sergeant Reeves later confirmed the assault through base security footage. Harding didn't write anything for a while. He just listened. When he finally spoke, his tone softened. "Lieutenant, you've shown remarkable composure under pressure, But you must understand something reporting a superior officer in a post like this. It isn't just brave, it's dangerous. Were you aware of the risks? Sarah's eyes lifted to meet his. Yes, sir. Then why did you do it? Her lips pressed together. The words didn't come easily. Because silence is contagious, sir, and I've seen what it does. My father died believing in this uniform. I couldn't let it be used by someone who wore it without honor. Harding's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did, a flicker of quiet respect. He clicked off the recorder. That's all, Lieutenant, you're dismissed. As she stood to leave, he added almost gently, for what it's worth, you did the right thing. Most don't. Sarah paused at the door. With respect, sir, doing the right thing shouldn't feel this lonely. Then she left. Outside, the air shimmered with heat. Trucks rolled past, soldiers whispered in corners. The investigation had begun, and with it rumors. Some said the generals were going to dismantle the entire chain of command at Fort Harland. Others said Briggs had been connected to something deeper. Reports, unauthorized operations, quiet threats that went unrecorded. No one really knew. But everyone could feel the shift. For years, Fort Harland had been a fortress of fear disguised as discipline. Now it was something new, uncertain, raw, vulnerable. Sarah walked past the barracks, eyes down, feeling the stares. Some were admiring, some were cautious, and some, from those still loyal to Briggs, were full of quiet resentment. She didn't respond. She learned long ago that courage didn't need applause. Mark Reeves caught up with her near the communications wing. He looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes not from work, but from conscience. "You okay?" he asked. She hesitated. "Define okay." He gave a small smile, still breathing. "Barely." They stood in silence for a moment, the dry wind whipping around them. Then he said, "They're digging into everything now. Not just him. Whole base structure. I heard they pulled records from the last 3 years. If there's corruption anywhere in command, they'll find it." Sarah looked out toward the horizon, the desert blurring into. "And what happens to us?" Mark shrugged. "We wait, and we hope they remember who started it." She smiled faintly. "Hope isn't regulation, Sergeant." "Neither is courage," he said quietly, "but you did it anyway." For a moment, she almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because she hadn't realized how much she'd needed to hear that. By evening, the base felt eerily quiet. The mess hall was half empty. Conversation stopped whenever she walked in. Even the younger recruits looked at her differently, as if trying to decide whether she was a hero or a warning. She sat alone with her tray, staring at the untouched food. Her head still throbbed from the impact, but it was nothing compared to the ache settling deeper, the weight of what came after courage. The waiting, the scrutiny, the isolation. She could feel it, the invisible walls closing in. For the first time, she wondered if she'd actually done the right thing, or if she'd just painted a target on her back. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mind if I sit?" It was General. His tray was untouched too. He sat across from her, the metal table creaking softly between them. No guards, no aides, just 2 soldiers and a silence full of truth. "You know," he said, picking up a fork and setting it down again, "I've been in this army 40 years. Seen every kind of man there is. The brave, the cowardly, the corrupt. But the rarest kind," he paused, meeting her eyes, "is the one who tells the truth when it costs them everything." Sarah didn't answer. She just looked at him, searching for any hint of formality, of protocol, but there was none, only sincerity. Leaned back. "Briggs isn't the first, won't be the last. Men like him rot institutions from the inside, but they only get away with it because good soldiers stay silent. You broke that." "Sir," she said softly, "I didn't do it to break anything. I did it because I couldn't keep pretending." He nodded slowly. "That's why it matters." They sat there for a while, the hum of the air conditioning filling the spaces between words. When he finally stood, he rested a hand on the table. "Lieutenant, what you did is going to make enemies. You understand that, right?" Sarah nodded. "I've made peace with that." Smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both pride and sorrow. "Then you're already stronger than most." When he left, Sarah sat in silence again, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt alive, like something was growing in that quiet space, something steady. Later that night, as the desert sky deepened to violet, helicopters thundered away from the base. The investigation team had finished their first sweep. Files seized, communications archived, entire divisions frozen pending review. The Fort Harland that existed yesterday no longer existed tonight. Sarah stood near the watchtower, hands in her pockets, wind tugging at her hair. She watched the horizon, endless and indifferent, and wondered how something as vast as duty could fit inside a single human heart without breaking it. She thought again of her father. He'd been calm like her, steady, the kind of man who believed rules meant something. But he'd also told her once, quietly, on the night before deployment, "If the system ever forgets the people it was built to protect, then it's your duty to remind it." She had never understood what he meant, not until now. By dawn, word had spread beyond Fort Harland. Encrypted reports, redacted statements, fragments of truth traveling through military channels faster than rumor could keep up. The media didn't know yet, but in conference rooms across Washington, officials were already using words like investigation, command abuse, integrity breach. The machine had started to turn slowly, painfully, but unmistakably. And at its center was one name: Lieutenant Sarah Collins. In the barracks, some called her the woman who took down a major. Others called her the risk. But those who'd watched that footage, who'd seen her stand up bleeding but unbroken, called her something else, quietly, almost reverently. The line that wouldn't bend. That morning, General Harding summoned her to the hangar. She arrived early, as always, standing at attention while the massive doors rolled open to reveal the pale light outside. The three generals stood together, papers in hand. "Lieutenant Collins," Harding said, his voice carrying over the echoing space, "Fort Harland will be placed under temporary suspension pending full review. Command restructuring begins immediately. You'll be temporarily reassigned to oversight at Arlington Command, effective today." Sarah blinked, surprised. "Sir, I didn't expect reassignment." Spoke gently. "You earned it, and you need it. The base will rebuild, but not until the infection is cleared." Stepped closer, his tone grave but warm. "Lieutenant, what happened here will change how command handles internal misconduct. It's bigger than one base, bigger than one officer. You've started something that will outlast all of us." For a long time, Sarah said nothing. Her throat tightened, words caught somewhere between disbelief and exhaustion. Then finally, "Thank you, sir." Harding nodded once. "You're dismissed, Lieutenant." As she turned to leave, called after her, "Collins, your father would be proud." She froze. Then, for the first time in days, she smiled, faint, quiet, almost invisible but real. Outside, the desert wind picked up again, carrying sand across the runway. Somewhere far above, the first rays of morning broke through the haze. The same sun that had witnessed every secret, every sin, now shining over something new. That night, as she prepared to leave Fort Harland, Sarah looked back at the compound one last time. The lights shimmered against the dark, the same way they had on the night everything changed. But now they looked different, not like stars on the ground. More like candles, each one burning for a truth finally seen. And as her transport lifted off the runway, Sarah watched the base shrink below her, the place where fear had ruled, and where courage had finally spoken. She closed her eyes. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. What happens after the storm ends? For most soldiers, it's the silence that's hardest to live with. The noise of chaos fades, but the memory of it doesn't. It lingers like the faint ringing in the ears after an explosion. Sarah Collins felt that silence now. Every morning she walked into the new halls of Arlington Command. The transfer orders had come through fast. One day she was standing on the sun-bleached tarmac of Fort Harland, watching helicopters fade into the horizon. The next, she was in Washington, surrounded by polished floors, perfect uniforms, and the unnerving hum of bureaucratic calm. Arlington wasn't like Harland. No desert winds, no echoes of night patrols, no ghosts of old fear. Here everything smelled of coffee and discipline, every movement rehearsed, every conversation precise. But underneath that composure, Sarah could feel it. The tension. The quiet knowledge that everyone knew who she was. They didn't look at her like a stranger. They looked at her like a story. The first week passed in paperwork and protocol. Sarah's new assignment was administrative, reviewing internal oversight reports, verifying disciplinary actions, signing off on procedural revisions inspired by what the Pentagon now called the Harland incident. The file was thicker every day. Dozens of other complaints had surfaced from across the country, small bases, remote outposts, forgotten corners of the system where power had festered unchecked. She wasn't proud of it exactly, but she understood what it meant. Her choice had broken something open. Every time she initialed another report, another testimony, she felt the same uneasy mix of pride and sorrow. These were people who'd stayed quiet for years until she didn't. Sometimes, when she was alone, she wondered if her father would approve of what she'd done. She could almost hear his voice, calm, steady, the way it had sounded on nights when thunder rolled through their old house in Texas. Courage doesn't protect you, Sarah. It just tells the truth about who you are. That was what he'd believed. Now she was learning what it cost. It started small, whispers in hallways, glances that lasted too long. Some of the older officers saw her as a symbol of reform. Others saw her as a threat. She heard them sometimes, just out of earshot. Collins, yeah, the one from Nevada. She took down a decorated major. Or maybe she just wanted attention. Every rumor was a bullet without sound. She ignored most of them, but not all. Because some nights, when the building emptied and the city lights bled through the blinds, she asked herself the same question they did. Had she done it out of duty or defiance? One evening, she stayed late in her office. The city beyond Arlington was wrapped in dusk, headlights cutting through the fog, the Potomac glimmering like a cold vein of steel. She sat with a single lamp on, reviewing a file stamped Classified Integrity Division. It was another misconduct case. Different base, different name, same pattern. A young cadet, a superior officer, the same silence. Her chest tightened as she read the statement. Every word felt like an echo of her own night, the fear, the disbelief, the pain. She closed the folder and leaned back, exhaling shakily. That's when she noticed the shadow in the doorway. Working late again. It was Colonel Pierce, her new commanding officer. Older, composed, with the kind of quiet intelligence that comes from decades in the field. Sarah straightened instinctively. Just finishing reports, sir. Pierce stepped inside, setting a coffee cup on her desk. You've read more disciplinary reports in 3 weeks than most officers see in a career. She smiled faintly. There's a lot of truth to catch up on. He studied her for a moment. You know the Harland case. It's still being discussed at the Pentagon. You changed things. But tell me honestly, Lieutenant, do you believe justice and peace can exist in the same uniform? She looked down at the folder, fingers tracing the embossed emblem of the eagle and shield. I used to, she said quietly. Now I think justice comes first. Peace follows if you're lucky. Pierce nodded, thoughtful. Keep that clarity, it's rare, but don't let it harden you. When he left, she sat in silence, staring at the cooling coffee. Don't let it harden you. It was good advice, but too late maybe. Because something inside her already had. 2 months later, Sarah was called to testify. The Fort Harland Investigation Committee had convened in a federal conference chamber, a place lined with flags and cameras, every inch of it polished and public. It wasn't just about Briggs anymore. It was about the culture that let men like him thrive. Sarah sat before the panel, senators, generals, officials with practiced empathy, while flashes from reporters' cameras filled the room like lightning. A voice from the panel asked, "Lieutenant Collins, in your opinion, what failed first at Fort Harland, leadership or accountability?" She answered without hesitation. "Neither. What failed first was fear, and we kept feeding it because it was easier than standing up." Another question came. "Do you believe the system can correct itself?" Sarah paused. "Only if people inside it remember that truth outranks loyalty." The room fell quiet. Even the photographers stopped for a beat. Afterward, as she left the chamber, a young cadet approached her. He looked barely 20, uniform crisp, eyes bright with something she recognized immediately: uncertainty. "Ma'am," he said, almost whispering, "I just wanted to say thank you. My unit talks about what you did all the time. You made people like me believe we could speak up." Sarah smiled softly. "Then don't thank me, do it." The cadet blinked. "Do what, ma'am?" "Speak when it's hardest to." He nodded, and that simple gesture felt heavier than any medal she'd ever received. Weeks turned into months. The Harland reform spread across bases nationwide. Mandatory reporting channels, ethics oversight, independent review boards. All because one lieutenant refused to stay silent. But the reforms didn't erase what came with its scrutiny, fame she didn't want, and the loneliness that followed heroism like a shadow. Some nights she found herself staring at the medal the generals had given her, the Medal of Valor that now sat on her desk, still inside its case. She hadn't worn it once. To her, it wasn't a symbol of victory. It was a reminder of the moment she fell against that wall, blood in her eyes, silence all around. Courage had saved her. But it had also taken something she couldn't name, a quiet belief that the world was fair. On her 5th month at Arlington, Sarah received a sealed envelope. No sender listed, just her name and clearance code. She opened it slowly, careful, expecting another report. It was a letter. From General Lieutenant Collins. "Fort Harland is operational again. New command, new leadership. The reforms you helped inspire are now standard protocol. The soldiers still talk about you, not as a victim, but as the one who reminded them that honor is louder than fear. You should visit when you're ready. Respectfully, R." Sarah folded the letter carefully, her eyes blurring slightly. For the first time in a long while, she felt something stir, not pride exactly. Something closer to peace. A week later, she stood again at the gates of Fort Harland. The desert looked the same, vast, windswept, endless, but the energy was different. You could feel it in the air. The soldiers saluted as she passed, not out of protocol but out of respect. The operations room had been renovated, new systems, new protocols. And in the center of the main corridor hung a framed photograph, a still from the security footage, captured at the exact second Sarah stood up after being struck. Below it, a plaque read, "Courage begins where silence ends." She stared at it for a long time, unable to move. Mark Reeves appeared beside her, smiling faintly. He looked older now, calmer. "You should seen it the day they put that up. Half the base cried." Sarah let out a quiet breath, almost laughing. "They shouldn't have." "Maybe not," Mark said, "but they needed to." They stood there for a while, two soldiers bound by a night that had rewritten their lives. The hum of machines returned, softer now, almost comforting. For the first time, Sarah didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like part of something healing. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the desert ridges, she walked to the same spot near the hangar where she'd sat that morning after the assault, the place where fear had once lived. Now the air was quiet, the horizon endless. She closed her eyes and heard her father's voice again, clear as the wind itself. Stand when it hurts, speak when it costs. That's all courage ever asks. When she opened her eyes, the world looked different. Not fixed, not perfect, but honest. And maybe that was enough. What does a soldier do when there's no war left to fight? For months, Sarah Collins had asked herself that question every morning when she laced up her boots. The war inside her was quieter now, but not gone. It lived in flashes, in memories she couldn't command to stand down. The world called her a hero. The headlines said Lieutenant Collins restores honor to the uniform. But headlines fade. And when the noise fades, all that's left is the echo. Fort Harland had changed. Where fear once ruled, reform had taken root. A new commander led with calm discipline. Younger officers spoke openly in debriefs, and the air, even the silence, felt cleaner. Yet every time Sarah walked the perimeter at dawn, she still saw ghosts. The way Briggs had turned, the disbelief in his eyes. The sound of her own breath when she stood back up. It played behind her eyelids like a film that refused to end. She had returned not as a subordinate, but as an instructor, ethical leadership and integrity oversight, a program the Pentagon had created in her name. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who had once been beaten for speaking truth, now taught others how to do the same. Her first class met in Hangar 3, a wide, echoing space converted into a training hall. 20 cadets stood before her, nervous, eager, each wearing the same green she once did. She watched them in silence for a moment, letting the weight of her gaze settle. Then she said quietly, "Every system in the world is only as strong as the silence it tolerates. You're here to break that silence." No lecture. Just those words and a long pause. One cadet, a young woman named, raised her hand. "Ma'am, what if it's your superior? What if you're wrong?" Sarah looked at her, really looked. The question was innocent, but she heard the fear behind it. "Then you investigate before you accuse," she said softly. "But if you're right and you say nothing, you're still part of the wrong." A murmur rippled through the room. The cadets took notes, some with wide eyes, some with trembling hands. She'd seen that expression before, the quiet understanding that truth always costs something. After class, lingered by the door. "Ma'am," she asked, "didn't it scare you that night?" Sarah smiled, small, tired, honest. "It still does." "Then how did you do it?" She thought for a moment before answering. "I stopped asking what would happen to me and started asking what would happen if I didn't." Nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant she'd remember those words when they mattered. And as the cadet left, Sarah felt something shift. Maybe this was her purpose now, not to fight, but to teach others not to look away. Days became weeks. Sarah found herself falling into rhythm again, classes, briefings, late-night reports. But every once in a while, when the base was quiet and the desert winds crept in through the cracks, the memories returned. She'd wake in the small quarters assigned to her, heart racing, knuckles white against the Briggs's voice echoing through the dark. "You think anyone will believe you?" She'd sit up, steady her breathing, look at the medal on the table and whisper to herself. They did. But the tremor in her hands always betrayed her. Courage, she realized, doesn't erase fear. It just learns to walk beside it. One Friday evening, Colonel Pierce arrived unannounced from Arlington. He found her in the observation deck, overlooking the airfield, notebook open, eyes on the horizon. "Still writing reports," he teased gently. "Just notes," she replied, "old habits." He joined her at the railing. Below them, soldiers practiced nighttime maneuvers, their shouts echoing faintly across the sand. "You've made this place something it hasn't been in years," he said. "Safe." Sarah shook her head. Safe isn't the same as healed. Pierce studied her profile, the calm expression that barely hid the exhaustion beneath. "You never give yourself credit, do you?" She smiled faintly. "Credit's loud, integrity's quiet." For a moment they stood in companionable silence. Then Pierce said, "There's talk in D.C. you're being considered for promotion, Captain Collins." She turned surprised. "I didn't apply." "You didn't have to." Her first instinct was refusal. "Sir, I'm not." "You are," he interrupted, "because men and women listen when you speak. That's command, whether you want the title or not." Sarah looked back out over the desert, the same endless stretch that had once witnessed her fall. "I'll think about it," she said. Pierce smiled. "That's all I needed to hear." When he left, the air felt lighter, but her chest did not. Promotion meant visibility, responsibility. And once again, standing in front of those who'd rather she sit down. She wasn't sure she had another battle left in her. That night, she walked past the memorial corridor, the framed photograph of her younger self standing after the strike. Someone had left flowers beneath it. No note, no ribbon, just a simple gesture. She crouched, touched the petals, fresh. And for the first time, she let herself cry. Not for pain, not for trauma. For survival. Because surviving isn't just continuing. It's learning how to live again after you've seen the truth too closely. A few weeks later, Sarah accepted the promotion. Captain Collins, the name sounded strange, heavier somehow. Her new office overlooked the airstrip. Every time a transport lifted into the sky, she felt a familiar ache, that longing for the simplicity of duty before it became symbolic. One afternoon, as she reviewed new ethics protocols, a message alert blinked on her monitor. Incoming encrypted transmission, priority low. She opened it absent-mindedly and froze. It was from Mark Reeves. "Ma'am, I know it's been a while. I'm stationed at Falcon Base now. We just finished our first ethics review under your program. Thought you should know it's working. They listen now. And they call it the Collins Rule." Sarah stared at the screen, eyes burning. The Collins Rule. 3 words that didn't feel like glory, they felt like closure. She typed back slowly. "Rules change behavior. People change systems. Keep them talking, Mark." When she hit send, she realized she was smiling, genuinely, softly, the way she hadn't since before everything. That weekend, Fort Harland held its first open-base ceremony since the shutdown. Families arrived, cadets performed drills, music floated across the tarmac. Sarah stood by the stage, watching it all unfold, the laughter, the ease, the normalcy she'd once thought impossible here. General approached, his steps slower now, his hair a little grayer. "Captain Collins," he greeted, shaking her hand firmly. "You did more than fix a base. You reminded us what we stand for." She looked around, soldiers, children, flags snapping in the wind. "Sir," she said quietly, "I didn't fix anything. I just stopped pretending it wasn't broken." Smiled. "That's how everything worth saving starts." He left her then, standing in the sunlight, the sounds of celebration behind her. She looked up at the sky, endless blue, no longer a cage but a horizon. And she whispered, almost to herself, "I think we're going to be okay." That night, long after the last truck had left, Sarah walked alone down the runway. The stars stretched wide above the desert, sharp and brilliant, the same ones she used to watch through the glass of the operations room years ago. She thought of her father again, not the soldier, but the man who once built model planes with her on the kitchen floor. He used to say, Planes don't really conquer the sky, Sarah. They borrow it for just long enough to do something that matters. She smiled through quiet tears. Maybe that was all any of them were doing, borrowing time, hopping to fill it with something that mattered. As dawn broke over the desert, light spilling gold over the towers and hangars, Sarah stood on the highest platform of the base, wind tearing through her hair, eyes fixed on the horizon. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, older now, yes, but unbroken. The voiceover of her thoughts would fade in here, soft, steady, resolute. People think courage is loud, that it's bullets and orders and flags in the wind. But real courage, it's the quiet decision you make when no one's looking. It's the moment you decide that fear will not write your story. She took one last breath of the cool morning air and whispered to the wind a promise, not a farewell. Dad, I kept the oath. The camera, if this were film, would pull back slowly, showing the vastness of the desert, the base gleaming in the sunrise, the insignia on her shoulder catching the first light. And the narration, quiet and final, would fade beneath the wind. Sometimes, the loudest victories aren't won in battlefields. They're carried quietly in the hearts of those who refuse to look away. They say every war ends. But for some, the battlefield just changes its name. For Captain Sarah Collins, that battlefield was now 3,000 miles away, under foreign sun, foreign sky, and a flag that still carried the same weight. 6 months after Fort Harland's reform was finalized, the Pentagon reassigned her to Camp Artemis, a joint NATO outpost operating deep in Eastern Europe. Officially, her mission was to advise local command on ethics integration and discipline review. Unofficially, everyone knew what it meant. She was the woman they sent when truth stopped being convenient. The plane descended through thick morning clouds, revealing a landscape of steel, snow, and smoke. The compound below looked nothing like Fort Harland, smaller, rougher, colder. Soldiers moved briskly between tents and prefabs, the air thick with exhaust and breath vapor. The moment she stepped off the ramp, the wind cut through her uniform like knives. A sergeant greeted her with a salute. "Captain Collins, ma'am, welcome to Camp Artemis. Colonel's expecting you." She returned the salute. "Thank you, Sergeant." As they walked across the icy tarmac, she could feel eyes following her, not hostile, exactly, but cautious. Rumors travel faster than radio signals in military networks. They all knew her story. The officer who brought down a major. The one who made the system listen. And now she was here to look at their house. Colonel met her in a prefabricated office warmed by a single space heater. He was in his 50s, built like stone, his accent sharp but respectful. "Captain Collins," he said, shaking her hand. "I read your file, impressive, but let's make one thing clear, this is not Washington. Things work differently out here." Sarah met his gaze evenly. "Respectfully, sir, things work the same everywhere. It's people who make them different." A flicker of irritation crossed his face, quickly buried. "You'll have full access to personnel records and disciplinary logs. Review what you must, but I run this base my way. We have no scandals here, Captain." She smiled faintly. "That's what they said at Fort Harland, too." He didn't respond, just gestured toward the door. "Your quarters are ready." The days that followed were quiet on the surface. Sarah spent long hours in the admin unit, sifting through reports, watching patterns form in silence. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Training schedule, patrol rosters, maintenance logs. But something felt off, too clean, too consistent. The kind of perfection that only comes from fear. She noticed it in the eyes of the soldiers when she passed, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence, the way they looked over shoulders before speaking. On her fourth night, she found what she was looking for. A report buried deep in encrypted archives, marked "Accidental Discharge, Closed Case." The details were vague, A private injured during night watch. No follow-up. But the timestamp matched a second file labeled security feed corrupted. Her gut tightened. She'd seen that dance before. When truth disappears behind classification, it's never an accident. The next morning, she visited the infirmary under pretext of an audit. The medic, a young corporal, hesitated when she asked about the incident. "Ma'am, I can't discuss classified injuries." She met his eyes, calm but firm, then discussed them as unclassified observations. The corporal swallowed. "He was shot, ma'am, point blank. They said it was an accident, but he didn't believe that, and then he asked for transfer. 3 days later, he was gone." "Gone," she repeated. "Reassigned somewhere east, I don't know where." She left without another word. The wind outside stung her cheeks as she stepped onto the frozen path between barracks. This wasn't oversight, it was concealment. Different country, same disease. That night she stood by the perimeter fence, watching snow fall through floodlights. She thought of Fort Harland, of blood on the wall, of the silence that followed. Hadn't she promised herself never to see that again? But here it was, just wearing a different uniform. A soft voice broke her thoughts. "Captain." It was a soldier, the same young corporal from the infirmary. He stood uncertainly, shifting from foot to foot. "Ma'am, there's something else," he said. "I didn't want to say earlier, not with cameras around." Sarah turned to him. "Go on." He hesitated, then handed her a data stick. "Security footage, night of the incident, it before they wiped it." "Who's they?" He looked around nervously. "Command. The colonel's adjutant major, he runs the night operations. Everyone knows he stopped himself. Just watch it, ma'am." Sarah slipped the drive into her jacket pocket. "You did the right thing." He shook his head. "I hope so." In her quarters that night, she locked the door and inserted the drive. The footage flickered to life, grainy low light, timestamped 200 hours. 2 soldiers arguing near the fuel depot. One pushes the other. Then a flash. The injured soldier falls. The shooter turns, not panicked, not accidental. He fires again into the air, staging chaos. And standing behind him, half in shadow, Major. Sarah's jaw clenched. The image froze on his face, calm, calculating. It was premeditated. She knew what had to be done. But she also knew what it would cost. The next morning, she requested a private meeting with Colonel. He greeted her coolly. "Captain Collins, to what do I owe this visit?" Sarah laid the data stick on his desk. "You have a problem, Colonel, and I have proof." He didn't look at it. "Be careful what you call proof." Her voice stayed calm. "The footage shows your adjutant staging an accident, covering it up, and your logs were edited after the fact." He sat back slowly, expression unreadable. "You've been busy." "Just doing my job." He folded his hands. "Do you know what happens when you accuse a senior officer in a foreign command post, Captain? You create instability, and instability costs lives." Sarah's tone didn't waver, and silence costs souls. For a long time they stared at each other. The heater clicked softly. Wind howled outside the tin walls. Finally he said, "Leave the drive. I'll handle it internally." She shook her head. "No, sir. You'll report it to Central Command. I'm forwarding a copy through secured channels as we speak." Something flickered in his eyes, admiration maybe, or resignation. "You really are who they say you are." Sarah stood. "With respect, sir, I'm just who I promised I'd be." When she left, he didn't stop her. That night, chaos returned to Camp Artemis. Military police arrived unannounced, escorted by 2 intelligence officers. Was taken into custody, shouting denials as they dragged him from the command wing. Soldiers watched from the shadows, stunned, silent, a mixture of fear and relief in their faces. Sarah stood near the operations tower, arms folded, expression steady. It wasn't triumph, it was inevitability. Truth, once spoken, always finds its echo. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Artemis changed. Briefings were tense but honest. Reports stopped being doctored. Soldiers began speaking freely, cautious at first, then confident. Colonel never mentioned the incident again, but his tone towards Sarah shifted, less guarded, more respectful. On her final day, he found her at the airstrip. Snow fell in soft flakes that melted on their uniforms. He saluted her properly this time. "Captain Collins, you've done what I couldn't." Sarah returned the salute. "You did what mattered, you listened." He smiled faintly. "Maybe you were right, things don't work differently out here after all." As her transport lifted off, she looked down through the small window. Camp Artemis grew smaller beneath her. The floodlights, the white roofs, the faint outlines of soldiers standing together instead of apart. And for the first time in months, she felt something close to peace. But deep inside, she also knew something else. Integrity isn't a destination. It's a journey without rest. She would never stop walking it. That night, back at a hotel in Brussels awaiting her connecting flight home, Sarah sat by the window, city lights reflecting off the glass. Her reflection stared back, calm, resolute, older. She pulled out her father's old pocket notebook, the one she'd carried since Fort Harland, and wrote in it for the first time in years. "It never ends, Dad. There's always another place where silence grows. But maybe that's what I'm meant for, to keep breaking it, one voice at a time." She closed the notebook, eyes misting, and whispered into the night. "I'm still standing." Outside, the streets glowed gold under the rain, soft, endless, alive. And somewhere in that hum of distant engines and quiet courage, the world kept turning. What happens when the world starts calling you a hero, but you never wanted to be one? For Captain Sarah Collins, home wasn't peace. It was noise. The kind that follows you through airport terminals, down city streets, into interview rooms lined with lights and microphones. Everyone wanted a story. No one wanted the truth. When she landed back in Washington, the cameras were already waiting. They had followed her since the arrest at Camp Artemis, headlines blaring across news feeds. "Captain Collins exposes corruption again." "The woman who changed military justice." She hadn't spoken to the press once. But that never stopped the world from speaking for her. Outside the airport, a reporter called out, "Captain Collins, what drives you to keep fighting the system?" Another shouted, "Do you think the military is broken?" Flashes, questions, voices. She didn't answer. She just kept walking, suitcase in hand, the sound of her boots drowned beneath the storm of cameras. Fighting the system. She wasn't fighting the system. She was fighting fear. And fear had no uniform. Her apartment was quiet, a one-bedroom near Arlington, walls bare, furniture sparse. The kind of place that belonged to someone always ready to move again. She dropped her duffel bag on the floor and exhaled. It smelled like dust and old paper. Her father's notebook sat on the table where she'd left it. She ran her fingers over the worn leather cover. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the discipline to act despite it. He'd written that once, years before Afghanistan. Now it read like prophecy. Sarah set it down, sat in the dim light, and listened to the hum of traffic below, to the silence in her chest that no metal could fill. She had everything they said a soldier should want: honor, recognition, purpose. And yet she felt empty. Because what they never tell you is this: when you become the story, you stop belonging anywhere else. 2 weeks later, she stood behind a podium at a defense ethics symposium, a sea of uniforms and press badges before her. They wanted her perspective on leadership, on courage, on reform. Her voice was calm when she spoke. Integrity isn't built by punishment, It's built by example. Soldiers don't follow words. They follow what they see. Applause flashbulbs. Someone asked, "Captain Collins, after everything you've done, do you feel proud?" She paused long enough for the silence to grow heavy. "Pride," she said finally, "is for victories. I've only survived lessons." A murmur moved through the crowd, half admiration, half discomfort. She didn't stay for the reception. That night, she visited the cemetery. Rows of white stones stretched into the mist, names etched in silence. Her father's grave sat near the edge, simple, clean, worn by rain. She knelt, gloved fingers brushing the inscription. Sergeant Daniel Collins, honor, duty, sacrifice. She smiled faintly. "You'd hate what they're saying about me, Dad. You always said heroes are just people who didn't get a choice." Her voice trembled, "But I chose, and I'm tired." The wind shifted, cold, soft, steady. It carried the faint sound of flags snapping in the distance. For a moment she closed her eyes. And just like when she was 12, she could almost hear him, calm, patient, alive in memory. "Tired's not failure, Sarah. It's proof you cared enough to keep going." Tears slipped down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them. She let them fall like part of the ritual, a soldier's prayer no one taught her, but she'd learned anyway. In the weeks that followed, invitations poured in: interviews, panels, documentaries. People wanted her to talk about courage, leadership, morality. Everyone wanted her voice. But the more she spoke, the less it felt like hers. She began declining the requests. She stopped answering calls. Her days became quiet again: coffee, morning runs, reports for the Pentagon's Integrity Board. And the silence started to feel almost peaceful. Almost. One evening she walked along the Potomac, the sky burning orange and gold. She passed two cadets in uniform sitting on the railing, laughing, trading stories. They noticed her and stood instantly. "Ma'am." She nodded with a faint smile, at ease. One of them, a young woman, stepped forward hesitantly. "You're Captain Collins, right, from Fort Harland?" Sarah nodded. "My brother, in the Navy," the cadet said. "He talks about you all the time. Says you're the reason he reported his co for misconduct last year." Sarah blinked. "He did?" "Yes, ma'am." They listened. "He said it changed everything." For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. She just nodded. Tell him I'm proud he did." The cadet smiled. "He'd say the same about you." They saluted her, then jogged away. Sarah stood there, the sunset bleeding into the river, feeling the weight of something both painful and beautiful. Her courage had become someone else's permission. Later that night, back at her apartment, she opened her laptop. Dozens of unread emails from soldiers and officers, stories, confessions, gratitude. One caught her eye. Subject line: "You don't know me, but I needed to thank you." She clicked it. "Captain Collins, I watched your hearing last year. I used to think people like me didn't matter in this system. I was wrong. I filed my report last month. It saved someone's life. You'll never meet me, but you changed everything. Stay strong. Corporal M." Sarah sat back, eyes wet, chest tight. She read the message twice, then a third time. And finally whispered, "Maybe that's enough." The next morning, she reported back to Arlington Command. Colonel Pierce met her in the corridor, carrying a folder under his arm. "Captain," he said, smiling faintly, "you've been busy not being busy." She chuckled softly. "I needed air." "Understandable, but I have something for you." He handed her the folder. "Special request from the Joint Ethics Council. They're assembling a permanent advisory board. They want you to lead it." She froze. "Lead it?" He nodded. "Title: Director of Integrity Operations. You'd oversee reforms across all branches, direct line to the Pentagon." She hesitated. "Sir, I'm not sure I'm ready," he finished. Neither is anyone who deserves the job. He turned to leave, then paused. You didn't just survive the storm, Collins. You taught the sky how to rain. She watched him go, the folder heavy in her hands, heavier than any metal. Because this time, it wasn't about proving courage. It was about sustaining it. That evening she walked to the reflecting pool near the Lincoln Memorial. The air was cool, the city alive with quiet. The water shimmered, broken only by the ripples of passing wind. She sat on the steps, watching her reflection, the uniform, the scar near her temple, the calm in her eyes that hadn't been there years ago. Her voiceover would come here, soft and measured. I used to think courage was a single act. A moment when you stand up and change everything. But it is. It's waking up the next day and doing it again, even when nobody's watching. Especially then. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Captain Collins. She turned. A woman in civilian clothes stood there, late 20s, nervous, eyes red from crying. I'm sorry, the woman said. I didn't mean to bother you, I recognized you. Sarah smiled politely. You're not bothering me. The woman hesitated, then whispered, My husband served under Major Briggs. I never got to thank you. Sarah's breath caught. You don't have to. I do, the woman said, voice trembling. He used to come home quiet, broken. He'd never say what happened, but after that night, when you stood up, something changed in him. He started to heal. He said you reminded him that not all uniforms forget what honor means. Tears welled in her eyes. You saved him, even if you didn't know. Sarah didn't speak. She just reached out and placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder. No, she said softly. He saved himself, I just went first. The woman smiled through tears. Thank you anyway. As she walked away, Sarah turned back toward the water. The city lights shimmered like 1,000 small truths, finally free to breathe. Later that night, alone in her apartment, she stood at the window looking at the stars above Washington. The same stars that had hung above Fort Harland, above every desert and base and battlefield she'd known. She whispered quietly, You were right, Dad. The enemy isn't always outside. Sometimes it's silence. And with that, she closed her eyes, exhaling the years between who she'd been and who she'd become. Outside, the city glowed, alive, imperfect, human. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah Collins felt at peace, not because the fight was over, but because it could continue, and she wasn't alone anymore. How do you say goodbye to a war that never really ends? For Captain Sarah Collins, the war had stopped being about weapons a long time ago. It was about conscience, about remembering what silence costs, and how much truth asks in return. It had been 3 years since Fort Harland. 3 years since a fist struck the side of her head, and a camera caught what the world wasn't supposed to see. Now she stood before the Pentagon, the same building where that footage had first arrived, about to give the final speech of her military career. The courtyard buzzed with quiet ceremony. Rows of soldiers in crisp uniforms filled the seats, the national flags rippling in the soft spring wind. Generals, officers, and cadets stood alongside journalists and civilians. Every major outlet was broadcasting live. A wooden podium waited at the center. On it a brass plaque read, Defense Ethics Reform Ceremony, honoring service through integrity. Sarah adjusted her uniform, the silver bars of her new rank, Major Collins, gleaming faintly in the morning light. When she looked around, she caught familiar faces. General Colonel Pierce, Mark Reeves. And near the front row, a young woman in cadet blues, the student who once asked, What if you're wrong? Sarah smiled faintly. Some questions stay with you forever. When her name was called, she walked slowly to the podium. The applause rose, then faded into respectful silence. For a moment, she just stood there, letting the stillness settle. Her eyes lifted to the horizon beyond the flags, where the light was soft, clear, endless. Then she began. 3 years ago, I thought courage was a moment. A single second when you stand up and everything changes. I was wrong. Her voice was steady, low, deliberate. Each word carried the weight of memory, of blood, of silence, of truth finally spoken aloud. Courage, she continued, isn't a single act. It's a habit, a discipline. It's what happens when you wake up every day and choose to keep believing in what's right, even when no one else does. The crowd listened, motionless. Behind her, the flags rustled like quiet applause from the wind. I was once told that silence can protect you, she said softly. That it keeps peace, prevents conflict, maintains order. But that's a lie. Silence doesn't protect anyone. It only protects the ones who abuse it. She paused, long enough for the stillness to deepen, long enough for the cameras to zoom in on her face. There's a cost to speaking up. I paid it, many of you will. But I would rather live with the pain of doing what's right than the comfort of doing nothing. As she spoke, her gaze swept across the audience, over faces she didn't know but somehow understood. Officers who'd served decades without being seen. Cadets who still believed they could change the world. And in their eyes, she saw it, the spark that keeps the uniform honorable. When my father died in Afghanistan, she said, her voice softening, I promised myself I'd wear this uniform with the same dignity he did. I thought that meant never showing weakness, never doubting, never questioning. But he once told me something I didn't understand until much later. The real enemy isn't outside the gates. It's the moment you stop listening to your own conscience. She looked down for a heartbeat, then met the crowd's gaze again. That's why I'm standing here today, not to be celebrated, but to remind you that integrity isn't a medal. It's a choice, every single day. General shifted in his seat, eyes bright with pride. Colonel Pierce nodded once, subtle but sincere. And somewhere near the back, Mark Reeves straightened his posture, jaw tight, remembering the night it all began, when fear had kept every other soldier frozen except one. Sarah continued, I've been asked 1,000 times if I regret it. If I regret pressing send. If I regret breaking the silence. She let the question linger, a pause that stretched like an open wound. Then she smiled faintly. I don't regret it. I regret that it was ever necessary. Applause began softly, respectfully, then grew, but she lifted a hand, gently stopping it. Her tone shifted quieter now, almost like a confession. You see, courage isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It's not in the medals, or the titles, or the headlines. Courage is the moment you refuse to look away, even when it hurts. The camera zoomed in as she exhaled slowly, voice steady. And if you take nothing else from my story, remember this. Dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The last line hung in the air like a prayer. The audience stood. The applause this time was not for fame, it was for truth. For the kind of strength that doesn't command, but inspires. Sarah stepped back from the podium, bowed her head briefly, and walked off stage. As she descended the steps, approached, eyes bright. Major Collins, she said softly, I wanted to thank you. I graduate next week, Integrity Corps Division. Sarah smiled. You earned that, don't thank me. But I wouldn't be here if you hadn't. Yes, you would, Sarah interrupted gently, because courage doesn't start with someone else's story. It starts with your own. Nodded, eyes misting. Then I'll make sure mine's worth telling. Sarah rested a hand on her shoulder. It already is. Later that afternoon, after the crowd dispersed and the flags were lowered, Sarah walked alone through the courtyard. The world had gone quiet again, just footsteps, wind, and the distant echo of ceremony fading into history. She stopped near the Pentagon reflecting pool, her reflection rippling softly in the water. The woman looking back at her wasn't the same one from that night at Fort Harland. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a witness, a reminder that truth doesn't die, it multiplies. As dusk settled, she found herself at the memorial wall, the one engraved with the names of soldiers lost to war. But tonight, she wasn't thinking about the battles fought overseas. She was thinking about the ones fought in silence, behind closed doors, in rooms where voices trembled before truth found them. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her father's notebook. The edges were worn, the pages yellowed. She flipped to the last blank one and wrote, "It's never about winning. It's about remembering who we are when no one's watching. If someone ever reads this, keep standing, even when your voice shakes." She closed the book, kissed its cover, and tucked it into the base of the memorial not as a loss, but as a legacy. Night fell over Washington. The city lights glowed gold across the river. Sarah sat on a bench overlooking the skyline, the wind brushing against her face, carrying the faint sound of a bugle from somewhere far away. Her voiceover would rise here, soft, contemplative, strong. "I used to believe justice was a destination, a place you reach if you fight hard enough. But it's not. It's a direction. You just keep walking toward it, knowing you'll never arrive but refusing to turn back." A faint smile touched her lips. "That's what my father taught me. That's what Fort Harland taught me. And that's what I'll carry until my last breath." As the camera, if this were film, pulled back slowly, the city unfolded below her, alive with the quiet hum of 1,000 unseen stories. Somewhere out there, a young cadet would decide to speak up. A commander would choose transparency over comfort. A soldier would remember her name, not as a symbol but as a standard. And as the music swelled, slow, solemn, rising, the narrator's final words would echo her legacy. "The world forgets its heroes, but it never forgets what they stood for. Because when one act of courage confronts an empire of silence, the world listens." In the distance, thunder rolled gently, not a storm, just a reminder. The fight never ends, but neither does courage. Sarah Collins sat there, calm, proud, unbroken, a soldier who had faced her own war and chosen integrity over comfort, every single time. The wind carried one last whisper across the night, her own voice, faint, steady, eternal. "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts." The screen would fade to black. Soft piano. A single line would appear, dedicated to every voice that chose truth over silence.